Buongiorno. Good afternoon. This is Frederick Ilchman, and I'm speaking to you as chairman of Save Venice. And we have a really exciting program. In this period when we can't be together, it's useful to underline and emphasize just how big some of Save Venice's restoration projects are. These are restoration treatments that are big in scope, in volume, and in ambition. And the longest standing and among the most triumphant restorations we have are Veronese's paintings in the Church of San Sebastiano. This is the sort of far southwest corner of Dorsoduro. It's in a hidden corner of Venice. It's an extremely beautiful church and full of really great paintings. Just remarkable that almost 500 years later, these paintings are still in their original places. Thus far, Save Venice, which began this restoration project in 2006-7, still working on the church. We've spent about $3 million US total, around 50 donors, and there have been sponsorships that have ranged from as small as, say, 7,500 or a little more, up to the hundreds of thousands of dollars to take on and preserve for future generations major sections of this extraordinary church. It's the generosity of individuals, and we hope you will consider joining this group. There is still more money to raise. Now, this church is hidden geographically, let's say, in the, as I said, sort of left-hand side of Dorsoduro, quiet Campo, but it is a masterpiece building and well-known to Venetians and well-known to historians of art. And in this next talk, you will get a real sense of the artist's achievement in this church and Save Venice's ongoing restorations of these works. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a bar where it's a question and answer. It says Q&A. You can use that or the chat, but use question and answer to ask questions or make comments. You can do that during the talk. And then, in fact, at the end, we will have a session to go over your questions and your comments and your opinions. So as you're moved, please enter this using the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So in 1555, when the prior of the Church of the Monastery of San Sebastiano needed a great painter, he had a wonderful, talented young artist, really brilliant, Paolo Veronese, to call. And this really led to an amazing episode stretching over decades for this church and an important chapter in the history of Venetian art. Well, we in Save Venice are lucky to have a similarly brilliant young genius to turn to, and that is Xavier Salomon, who is the chief curator of the Frick Collection, an expert on Italian art and Venetian art specifically, really dedicated his own career to the art of Paolo Veronese. And he's the person, longtime supporter of Save Venice and Save Venice board member, he's the person that will bring this artist and this gorgeous monument to life for us today. Xavier.
Thank you, Frederick. I hope everyone can see me and hear me. So good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. Today I'm going to be talking about obviously one of my favorite churches in Venice. And as Frederick said, you know, we're all at home. I wish I could be talking to you from San Sebastiano today, from Venice, but hopefully that will be soon enough. It's appropriate to talk about this church because, as you can see it here in all its glory after the Save Venice restoration of the exterior and the facade, this is a church that was originally created as a very small oratory in the late 14th century, in the 1390s, dedicated to the Virgin Mary by a group of Girolamo monks that had come from Rimini to Venice. But later in the 15th century, in the middle of the 15th century, the church was expanded. It was built as a much larger structure. And again, it was then rebuilt in the early 16th century, starting around 1506 and finishing in the late 1540s by Antonio Abbondio de Scarpagnino, who was the architect responsible for the structure as we know it. Now, the change in the dedication of the church from the Virgin Mary to Saint Sebastian was due to the plague. And so this is a church that is associated with one of the protectors, the saints, who is usually considered an intercessor against the plague, Saint Sebastian, and you see his statue at the top of the facade. And so it's an appropriate church for our times. I mean, I'm not entirely sure who the saint protecting people against COVID will be, or what churches will be built, but clearly this is a church that was built in response to a moment of crisis in Venice. But we're not going to really be talking about that today. And I only have 20 minutes. We have half an hour. I could be talking to you about this church for days, and I'm going to spare you. But what I will want to talk about today is the role of Paolo Veronese in the church. And when Paolo Veronese arrives in Venice in the early 1550s, this is what he finds. This is the church as it exists in terms of its external structure. The church is completed in 48, but it's not really dedicated, as we will see, until 62. So Veronese arrives at a crucial moment for this church. What I want to talk today about is some of the discoveries we've made through Save Venice in terms of restoration in the church, in the paintings of Paolo. But I also want to talk about another aspect of Paolo. If you lived in the 1550s in Venice, Veronese was someone who could, as this advert says today, decorate your interiors and exteriors. And this is not a joke. This actually really exists. It's some person who does this, decorates interiors and exteriors today in Ponzone Biellese in Lombardy. But anyway, what I want to talk about is the fact of thinking about Veronese as an artist who decorates an entire space. And he's not, unlike Titian and Tintoretto, who worked very much in specific sites in terms of paintings and often even worked in cycles, but Veronese is really thinking about how all of his works sit within a broader space. And so I want to give you an idea of that and give you an idea about Veronese's other roles at San Sebastiano, not just as a painter, because in fact, Veronese acted at San Sebastiano in the interior also as a designer of architectural and sculptural features. Now, this is something that I'm thinking a lot about Veronese today, because I'm beginning to work on a biography of Veronese, which will be about some of these aspects of his life. And one of the very important things to think about is that when Veronese is born and grows up in Verona in the 1530s, effectively, and early 40s, he comes from a family of stonecutters. His father is a stonecutter, his grandfather is a stonecutter. He works on architectural fabrics that Michele San Michele, the architect, is building at that time in Verona. So he has this background of stonework, of architecture and architectural design. These sort of Scarpellini were people that would actually design and carve things like capitals in buildings and columns and things of that kind. As we will see, we have evidence of Veronese working in wood and stone, designing and possibly even carving things himself later on in his career. So at San Sebastiano, it's really this sort of microcosm of his work and the different ways in which he interacts there. David Rosand, who of course you all know and has been one of the greatest art historians working on Veronese, drew this very interesting link between Veronese and theater, which I still think it's, his article is one of the best things written about Veronese in that respect. But I think we can expand that and think of Veronese working and acting on a much larger stage. And I think the stage at San Sebastiano is one that is a very comprehensive stage, but at the same time, as we will see, a rather ad hoc system. And it's a bit of a contradiction, but I hope to make that clear to all of you. Veronese reaches Venice and starts working in the early 1550s there, but in 1555, he creates his first work at San Sebastiano, which is the ceiling of the sacristy. And why does Veronese get called at San Sebastiano? Because the parish priest there, a man called Torlioni, is from Verona himself. And in fact, a lot of Veronese's work in Venice in those years is through a network of Verona aristocrats, priests, or people with connections to Verona. And so this is indeed what happens at San Sebastiano. And as Frederick mentioned, one of the great things about San Sebastiano is that Veronese works there for pretty much most of his career, at least for 20 years, if not more. So we have early works by him, later works by him, all present at the church. The ceiling of the sacristy is finished in 55, executed in that year. But as we will see next, what Veronese is doing is not only painting the canvases that go in the ceiling, but he's also creating the design of the ceiling itself. And the ceiling of the sacristy with the coronation of the Virgin in its center, it's so successful that a year later, the priest calls them to paint the ceiling of the church itself. And here you see the entire church. Now, looking at this church, you can see that the ceiling, the frescoes, the decoration of most of the side chapels, the organ on the left, the presbytery at the very bottom of it, are all by Veronese. So everything, fresco canvases, the design of the ceiling, the design of the fictive architecture in this church is all by one man. And as we will see in a second, even other aspects are by him. So this is what I want to consider, how this artist is sort of enveloping the interior of this entire church in this decoration. When people want to despise a painter like Veronese, or even later on Tiepolo, they tend to dismiss them as decorative painters. And it's precisely to dismiss that art historians like David Rosand wrote seminal articles and essays trying to counteract that. And I think I stand somewhere in the middle, in the sense that I do think that Veronese is a decorative artist, but I don't think decorative is a pejorative word or adjective. He is decorative in the sense that he is thinking of these spaces as overall spaces. And if you think of Villa Barbaro at Maser, one of his great masterpieces, that's exactly what he's doing. He's enveloping the interior of a Palladio building with frescoes, fictive architecture, fictive statues, all of that together. And unfortunately, there are several other examples by Veronese of this, which either don't survive or survive in very compromised state. So the Villa Soranza at Treville, which was one of the first things he did, was very much along these lines, where he painted most of the interior of that villa, designed by his friend, the architect San Micheli. And then the Palazzo Trevisan at Murano is a very similar situation, unfortunately in very compromised state, but there again, in a series of spaces of that palace, he does the same thing. So how does Veronese think about these spaces as a whole? At San Sebastiano, there's been a lot of arguments that there was a plan from the beginning, that the parish priest wanted Veronese to work, of course, in various phases, but with a predetermined plan of what was going to go on the walls, on the ceiling, on the altars, and in the various areas of the church. And I personally think that's actually not the case. And as we will see, there is evidence that that wasn't the case. So what seems to be happening is that Torlioni starts with the sacristy. He likes the ceiling. He asks Veronese then to do the one in the church. And then a series of commissions happen after that, sometimes having to erase something that had been done previously. And in a minute, we'll talk about that. So the ceiling is the next step in 1556. And we know Veronese works on the ceiling with the help of his brother, Benedetto, who is really one of the great heroes of Veronese's life. He works in the shadow of Veronese for all of Veronese's career and for 10 years beyond Veronese's death. But he's very active from the very beginning. He's exactly 10 years younger than Paolo and dies 10 years later. So they both live 60 years. Paolo, 1528 to 1588, and Benedetto from 1538 to 1598. So here's the ceiling, but think again that the design of the ceilings, so the compartments, the wooden parts, even though they're actually built by carpenters, they're again designed by Veronese. So he's thinking not just of the three canvases, the beautiful canvases with the story of Esther, but he is also thinking about how these sit in this extraordinary space. And what we can see a little bit from this photo, but it was very clear when people were up on the scaffolding and looking at this close up, is that parts of this are painted on canvas, but a lot of it is painted directly on the wood in situ. Here is one of the great canvases of the ceiling. And here's just to say that as magnificent and marvelous this whole ensemble is, there are issues with conservation. And some of these issues are non-reversible. So one of the studies that was undertaken when these were conserved a few years ago involves the skies. Many scholars have written pages, very beautiful, poetic pages, about how Veronese tends to put his colorful figures against these gray, rainy skies so that the figures jump out in a more vibrant way. We now know that that is actually not the case at all. And the skies were originally bright blue. They were painted with smalt, which is a fugitive pigment when it's combined with oil. And so the blue then develops into this sort of weird gray that you see up in the sky. So you have to imagine that this scene and all of the scenes in many of these paintings would have been set against a bright blue sky, which unfortunately is now gone. Here is the restorers placing the canvas back in place. These were removed from the ceiling for restoration. I was lucky enough to be in the church with other Save Venice members, staff members, on the day the canvases were put back up on the ceiling. And it was a very extraordinary moment to see these huge paintings. And this gives you a sense of the scale as well of how they finally got back up where they belong. From the ceiling, Veronese moves downwards. And I think this is a typical case with churches. Churches tend to be built from the apse going to the facade, which is why so many facades of churches in Italy are unfinished, or in cathedrals, they're always the last things to be done. And in the same way, the decoration logically starts from the ceiling and moves downwards, because that is the logical way to do it. So the next step is decorating the walls. And as you can see, the walls are decorated with a series of figures, but also with these incredible columns and garlands of fruit and flowers. And at the bottom, you can see in the spandrels of the arches of the chapel, in this case, 4 of the apostles. There would have been 12 all the way around the church. But you can also see how the real architecture and the fake architecture interact. So one detail that I particularly love is if you look at the grills along this balcony, the upper ones are actually carved in stone. The ones below, which alternate in color, to a yellow, to a blue, to a yellow, are painted. But then if you turn the corner to the right, those same oval grills become real in stone, and they were also painted yellow and blue. So there is this constant effect between reality and fiction, which is something that Veronese is hugely interested in. Of course, it's a theatrical idea, but it's also very much a characteristic of his art. And you also see that some of these scenes are almost like scenes from a window. So the scene on the left with Saint Sebastian looks as if you're looking through a window. The scene, the figures in the middle, the sibyls and the angels, are almost like living figures sitting in the architecture. And then you have fictive statues like the one on the right in a niche, and then real statues forward in the balcony. And this is true of the opposite wall as well. Now, these walls, unfortunately, have suffered because of humidity, more or less, depending on the wall and the windows, and there's been issues on them. So this was another big restoration for, Save Venice, and all of these were painted around 1558. Here's just a detail of one of these very beautiful sibyls, again, set against one of these fictive grills, which in some cases are real, and another statue. And this, again, to give you the sense of the marble statue painted in a niche surrounded by marble columns, with then these garlands of flowers as if they're real flowers, and these beautiful polychrome marbles. It's a really interesting depiction of space and a way of articulating space in a very interesting way. And I think, you know, later on, of course, Tiepolo does the same. But Titian and Tintoretto never really do anything on this scale. And it is something that is based very much on a central Italian tradition, which Veronese has through Verona and Mantua, more than other typically Venetian artists. Veronese uses the space in the church in extraordinary ways. And this is possibly my favorite moment. 2 frescoes, one across the other in the nave, show the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. And you have 3 archers on one side of the church on the left, and then Saint Sebastian being hit by those arrows on the right. So he's playing with the space as if this is happening in real life, and you have to imagine these arrows flying over your head as you stand in the church below, and it's an extraordinary idea. In the late 1580s, Veronese works on the organ, and the organ is important for 2 reasons. I mean, apart from being a very beautiful object, and here you see it closed with the presentation of Christ to the temple in the closed shutters, but it is important because it goes to cover frescoes. And so this is the real proof that the plan wasn't originally all planned as it is from the beginning. So they finished the frescoes, and then the parish priest and Veronese must have decided to do the organ, but the organ goes to cover effectively, and in some ways destroy, frescoes that had just been finished. So behind that organ, and we know that now because the organ was removed for restoration, there are figures by Veronese which are basically invisible and were photographed at the time, but we know there are sibyls under that fictive window. And below, the architecture has also been reworked to accommodate the organ. But the other interesting part is that the organ itself, not just the shutters, and here you see the open wings with the miracle of the pool of Bethesda, was also designed by Veronese. So we know the name of the Marangone, the carpenter who built the organ, the structure, but the capitals, the columns, the tympanum, all of that, the architectural design of that was done by Veronese. So he's not only thinking about his paintings, but he's thinking about how they're framed and how they sit within this extraordinary space at San Sebastiano. We now move to the high altar, and we're moving in chronological order. This is Veronese in the early 1560s and mid 1560s. And again, the frame, you see here the altarpiece being moved, but the frame that surrounds this altarpiece, this extraordinary colored marble structure, and think about the architectural design of the triangular tympanum with the round arch in it, is exactly the same as the organ. Again, it's designed by Veronese, Veronese the stonecutter. Veronese as a young man signs contracts and paintings as Veronese the stonecutter as Paolo, sorry, the stonecutter, before he becomes Paolo Veronese from Verona. Of course, while he's in Verona, there's no point of identifying himself as Paolo from Verona. He is in Verona. But once he moves to Venice, he changes his name in that way. Now, here what you see also is that the upper part being blank, the apse at the back, that was originally also frescoed. And the apse, the dome, and the spandrels were entirely decorated by Veronese with the Assumption of the Virgin, the Doctors of the Church, and God the Father. And all of that unfortunately collapsed later in the 17th century. It was then rebuilt and redecorated by Sebastiano Ricci, and then all of that was lost. In the 19th century, it was repainted with geometrical patterns, and now it's all blank. But through restoration, we made the wonderful discovery that two lunettes very up high in the church, which were dismissed by the bibliography on San Sebastiano before, these are on canvas, and may substitute pre-existing frescoes that were deteriorated, show the evangelist. And the ones on the right, St. Mark and St. Luke, are clearly by Veronese, and again, set in this architectural setting. The ones across St. John and St. Matthew instead are by a later 17th century artist who still needs to be identified. I've been trying to identify a painter for this, and I have to confess that so far I've failed. So we're not entirely sure about what happens there, but you have to imagine that these two scenes would have then been also surrounded, what you see on the left and right are the spandrels of the dome, and those would have also had figures of doctors of the church. So you would have had the doctors of the church next to the evangelist, again, giving you the sense of an entire decorated space. At the bottom, you also see a frieze, which imitates a carved frieze, and that is painted on canvas and attached to the wall. So this is an extraordinary way of decorating a church. I could talk for a long time about the two-side canvases in the presbytery. These are done in the late 1560s, absolutely spectacular. This is Sebastian exhorting Marcus and Marcellinus to follow him in his martyrdom. But again, think of the buildings in the background, the statues in the background, the way Veronese is setting this scene and the opposite scene of Sebastian's martyrdom in front of these theatrical scenes, as David Rosand beautifully put it. So you're almost witnessing two stage sets on the sides of the presbytery. And these are amongst the greatest things Veronese did at San Sebastiano. Unfortunately, again, with a deterioration of the sky pigment, in this case, it's more orangey brown than gray, but you have to imagine how extraordinary these would have looked when the sky was blue. Another discovery through restoration, this is a canvas in one of the side chapels, very recently finished, the Baptism of Christ, which everyone in the literature dismissed. This is workshop of Veronese, is maybe Benedetto, is maybe one of his children. It's clearly not by him, it's not good enough. It's clearly an issue of conservation and the state of the work rather than authorship. And by cleaning, I'm absolutely convinced that this is entirely Paolo. It's a pretty fantastic Paolo. It did suffer a lot, and that's part of the problem with it. But clearly, Veronese also worked on, and we know on a number of occasions, on altarpieces for the side chapels at San Sebastiano. The project we're working on right now is the Barco, the upper balcony that you just about saw from those slides of the interior before. This was the monk's loft. And here we're looking at the wooden seats of the monks, which always looked a sort of dark brown, but through cleaning, we've actually discovered that they also had decorations. Now, if Veronese was involved with these or not, we don't know in this case, but again, it would have enriched the decoration of the space substantially. And the latest discovery, which I also find is the most beautiful as far as I'm concerned, is the door to that space, which was a brown door. And by cleaning, we've now worked out that it is entirely decorated by Veronese with, and this is work in progress, of course, that I'm showing you. It hasn't been finished yet, but it shows different roundels of precious marbles and decorations as if it was, again, part of this entire internal envelope of the church. Veronese dies in 1588 and he is buried at San Sebastiano. And I'd like to finish by reading what Ridolfi says about Veronese's death and burial. It is extraordinary and very important that he is buried in this church. I always think of Christopher Wren, who's buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and his inscription on the tomb says, if you're looking for his monument, look around yourself. And this is the same for Veronese. The church around him is the monument to Veronese. So Ridolfi, the biographer, tells us that the world sighed at such heavy loss, and heaven rejoiced as it welcomed such a pure soul. The body of Paolo was then buried with a funeral ceremony by his brother and sons in San Sebastiano in the midst of his work, as that theater of glory which he had created with his brush was his only worthy epitaph. And next to the organ, they placed his effigy, majestically sculpted by Camillo Bozzetti. It was not possible on this narrow slab to enclose all of the immortal merits worthy of being recorded by the hand of eternity among the resplendent images of Andromeda, Cassiopeia, and Perseus in the heavens. So here we are at San Sebastiano, as Frederick mentioned. This is something that has gone a long way. We've worked on this for 14 years. We've raised 3 million for it, but there's still a lot to be done. The side chapels next to the altar on the left and right still need restoration. There are areas adjacent to the Barco and the bell tower and the sacristy that still need work. So I hope to see you all very soon in Venice and be in San Sebastiano all together. And we very much look forward to finally finishing as soon as possible, we hope, this project, because this is going to be one of the grandest, greatest, most important projects that Save Venice has been involved with. I'm not saying that just because I'm a great fan of Paolo Veronese, but I do believe that this is a jewel in the history and the culture of Venice, and one that is worth taking care of, preserving, and we've done so much for it. Let's go all the way and finally finish it off. So thank you very much, and I'd like to open the floor now to questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Xavier. That was spectacular. What a great talk. I think Paolo Veronese himself would be pleased. So remember, there's a command on the bottom of your screen, the Q&A or chat. You can put a question in there and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I've got a couple right for you off the top, which is one, you mentioned that baptism, a dismissed painting that appears to be in much higher quality, even if the condition is compromised. What about, as this process is going on, downgrades? Are there any Paolo Veronese paintings you think, you know, what's been in the literature by Paolo should probably be assigned to Benedetto or yet another hand? Or are there examples that are not collaboration so much, but entirely by one artist who's not Paolo?
In San Sebastiano or in general?
In San Sebastiano.
I actually don't think so. You know, we know he works with other people on the ceiling, for example, but it's very difficult to divide the hands. And I don't think the workshop worked in a way where one person would do a figure, another person would do a figure, and another person would do a tree and a building. I think they were much more consistent in working and probably working on layers of paint. So you can imagine that, you know, Veronese lays out the composition and then someone in the workshop fills in the colors, and then Veronese goes on top and finishes off the colors. But the surface as it stands on top of all of this, I think it's basically 99.9% Veronese. Sure, there are some decorative figures in grisaille in certain areas that are a little bit weaker, and maybe by someone in the workshop, maybe by Benedetto, maybe by Fasolo, who's another artist that Veronese is working with at San Sebastiano. Later in his career, he clearly relies on the workshop more. And the one painting that is not at San Sebastiano anymore was the big supper he designed for the refectory of San Sebastiano, which doesn't exist anymore. And the supper is now in Brera. That, I think, it's a weaker painting in general. I still think it's Paolo directing the enterprise, but probably a lot of workshop help at that point. But I think everything we see at San Sebastiano is pretty much him, you know, with help. But then which artist is working? You know, it's crazy to think of an enterprise of this scale without any help. So clearly he has other people supporting him.
And that makes a lot of sense. In fact, that he's painting, he's directing, he's running the workshop, he's teaching, but he's but putting a lot of personal attention into this. I mean, he has many other commissions going on, and so if he's really throwing himself into it, it means it's important to him. And I think that this, as you mentioned, with his tomb and the concentration, it's quite something.
And I think the thing to think about with Paolo as well, which people mention but don't think about too much, is how fast he is. Titian and Tintoretto are much slower, and we know that. And it's not a question of being better or worse as a painter, it's just a question of your technique. Veronese develops a fresco technique, which by nature has to be very fast. You know, you paint, it dries, within a few hours, it's done. So he paints in oil in a very similar way, which Titian and Tintoretto don't do. We have documents that show that he did 3 very large altarpieces in 3 months. That ceiling, it's a huge thing. It took, say, Venice 2 years to restore it. It took Paolo 1 year to paint it. So it's interesting to think about that. And I think he's someone that people call in because they know he can do it quickly, he can do it effectively. He's also someone who works a lot on drawings, and by the time he attacks a composition on canvas or on a wall, he knows exactly what he's doing and he makes very little changes. Titian and Tintoretto make a lot of changes as they go along. They think as they're creating. Veronese is very systematic, and I think that's something that is very well loved by the patrons because they know they're going to get something done. Think that he's working on the apse of this more or less at the same time as he's working at Maser. So he's clearly very multi-talented and working on a number of different big projects at the same time.
Well, in fact, that's one of the questions. What else was he working on in the same years that he was here? So just to give an idea of some of the big commissions in Venice or in the Veneto.
Well, I mean, the answer is pretty much everything he was working on. So in the 1550s, he's working in the sacristy and on the ceiling, but he's also finishing working at the Ducal Palace. He's working on the ceiling of the Library of St. Mark's. And there is a famous competition. Different artists create 3 canvases each for that ceiling. And Veronese wins the gold chain as opposed to all the other artists who collaborated on that project. In the 60s, he's working on all the big suppers. So if the altarpiece at San Sebastiano, and again, the dates of the presbytery are a little bit up in the air, but let's say he's working on the altarpiece in the early 60s and the side canvases in the mid 60s, that is the time when he's producing the big supper for San Giorgio Maggiore, which is now at the Louvre. Those are going hand in hand. And I can imagine him coming to San Sebastiano, being on a scaffolding there, painting something, and then in the afternoon or the next day going to San Giorgio and working on another figure there. So these are clearly projects that are working in a parallel way and not just one after the other.
That's a good point about being not sequential, but sort of overlapping. Here's a question. What do you think is the absolutely best painting in San Sebastiano? The single best example?
That's a hard question.
But your personal taste.
It's like, which of your children is your favorite child? I mean, it's, I love the presbytery canvases, the ones on the side. And I think maybe the Marcus and Marcellinus, to me, it's such a great, spectacular Veronese, but that is really pushing it. If I could take one home, it would be one of the evangelists, probably either the Saint Mark or the Saint Matthew from the sacristy. I love those. I think they're very, very beautiful. But as I say, it's really hard to choose one.
Well, there's so many good ones. I mean, yeah, I'd go for the Triumph of Mordecai and those great horses. I think that's just magnificent. So here's a question. Do we know much about the immediate reception of the ceiling and frescoes? I mean, are there comments, for example, or not much recorded?
Not much recorded. Vasari mentions it. Vasari writes in 68 and he mentions that Veroneses at work there, but he doesn't get into any qualitative judgment of the work. We know from Ridolfi, but of course Ridolfi is a biographer who's writing long after Veronese is dead. Ridolfi tells us that the ceiling of San Sebastiano was such a great success because no one had seen anything quite like that in Venice before. And so this really helped promoting Veronese's art in Venice. And, I'm assuming that is probably right. Unfortunately, we don't have anything else. So we don't have any very, first-hand accounts of the unveilings or people's direct responses to it. But for all we know, it's a very successful series of things. And of course, if in the same year he's finishing the ceiling, he's winning the gold chain for the library, admittedly a different project, but it goes to show that as an artist, he's well revered. The chain, interestingly enough, the prize is given out by Titian, who doesn't take part in that competition. And I always wondered about the relationship between Titian and Veronese, because it's almost as if Titian sees Veronese as such a different artist from himself that he doesn't feel threatened by him. My feeling has always been that Titian feels a lot more threatened by Tintoretto than he does by Veronese, because Veronese is working for a different audience. He's doing a very different thing. And Titian somehow doesn't see him as such a dangerous rival. Well, I think Tintoretto it's closer to Titian's heart in a way that it's more problematic for him. But that's just my idea.
Well, I think maybe one answer to that question are the number of paintings that are made in Veronese's style or using his kinds of conception of ceiling works in the next few years. I mean, those are the kind of aftermath of that. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for the questions, and thank you so much, Xavier, for stimulating presentation, and all of you for joining us. This is really encouraging. We've got great attendance, and many of you are donors to this project and know how much this means to Save Venice and to Venice. I'll send on now my best wishes to you. Thank you for your support of this organization as Italy and Venice reopen this week and next. It's really so encouraging and really appealing to know that our restoration work is continuing in this glorious church, doing the honor that Paolo Veronese deserves greatly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.